You have to look carefully, but if you do, down at the bottom of Peter Bruegel the Elder's landscape with the fall of Icarus, there's a partridge. It's not in a pear tree. That's Perdix, Icarus's cousin. Like his uncle Daedalus, Perdix invented, and amongst many things he invented was the saw, which he did after observing a fish's bones and then, taking one step into the adjacent possibility, went from one thing to another. In a fit of jealousy, Daedalus threw him off the cliff, of course he did. To save him from certain death, Athena transformed him into the partridge. Now, the fall traumatized Perdix so much that the partridge is still, to this day, the only bird that is afraid of heights. It nests in bushes and hedges close to the ground. From Daedalus to Perdix, Moreton Vale, Bell and Grey, and even today with Elon Musk and Hassabis, invention and jealousy and human nature go hand in hand. The Greeks had worked something out that I discovered writing the book and recording this podcast. After Elisha Gray died, you may recall that from the Bell episode, the note found in his possessions read, "The history of the telephone will never be fully written. It is partly hidden away and partly lying on the hearts and consciences of a few whose lips are sealed, some in death and others by a golden clasp whose grip is even tighter." Welcome everybody to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. It is the season finale. Yay! Well done me. We can finally now leave the Victorian times behind us and leave behind us the age of electricity, because we are about to step into season 2 and, of course, the age of information. But we have a few loose ends that we need to tie up. Our journey back from 1799 to the future we're in now started when Galvani's assistant, with static electricity building up on their body, touched the most sensitive voltmeter of the day, the frog's leg, and then it twitched. The ensuing battle, of course, between Galvani and Volta gave us the battery, the first continuous and thus controllable source of electricity mankind had ever got their grubby little hands on. Centuries later, journalists would call Robert Oppenheimer the modern Prometheus, but really I do think that moniker belongs to Volta. And thus Volta had toppled a domino that brought humanity the world in which we all live today. On the one hand, systems of lighting and communication were all powered by the descendants of the battery. We've really seen this in season 1. But on the other hand, the end of religion arrived only 100 years after Galvani's discovery. Churches and religions were replaced by secular alternatives. For example, in New York, Felix Adler's ethical movement, which of course Robert Oppenheimer would become a graduate of. Therefore, the importance of this moment in our history, the moment when Galvani made that frog's leg twitch, cannot be overstated. Since then, technologies have changed, society has changed, but human nature has not. Indeed, that is the central theme of the book and the podcast, Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. Human nature is pretty immutable, even though technologies change quickly. With that in mind then, on today's season finale, we are going to tighten up all the loose ends. We're going to return to the themes we visited and package them all up neatly together. We're going to look at what do they mean, not in Victorian times, but right now in 2026, for all of those people who are dipping their toes into the world of generative AI. And we're going to begin back more or less where we started. We are going to begin with Samuel Morse, and we're going to learn something about him and Alexander Graham Bell that you've possibly not read in your textbooks. Tucked away in St. Peter's Churchyard in Morristown is where his antecedents had settled, the humble gravestone reads, "Inventor of the telegraphic dot and dash alphabet." This is not Samuel Morse's grave, this is Alfred Vail's grave, and the epitaph not a smoking gun, but nevertheless is a circumstantial nail in the coffin of the fiction of Samuel Morse's legacy. The first nail in the coffin, in my opinion, is of course his recollection in a eureka moment of the idea of the telegraph hitting him right there on the deck of the Sully on his return trip from Paris. He'd been hidden away there, processing his grief from the death of his wife. But the story of the Sully is bullshit. And all bullshit is plausible. In fact, plausibility is what makes a lie or a half-truth bullshit. It has to be a little bit believable. Why? Why is it plausible? Well, firstly, there's no such thing as a eureka moment, so that's how we know it's bullshit. They don't exist. Instead, a flash of insight arrives, but only after years of preparation and incubation have occurred. The eureka moment is a reflection of how humans recount memories and tell stories, which is why Morse's bullshit story, as well as playing directly to the truth bias that all humans have, speaks to that old romantic idea propagated by Mary Shelley with her Victor Frankenstein that men, scientists, engineers work alone and inspiration comes flying at them from the divine, from the middle of nowhere. All throughout the podcast and all throughout the book, we have seen that eureka moments are bullshit. Years of work, years of prep, years of incubation, and then only after the insight do further years of verification happen. What we saw in the podcast in regards to Samuel Morse, and again, this is another nail in the coffin of his bullshit story, is that he was pathetic. He lacked tenacity, common sense, and common decency in his dealings with a much younger Vale, whose naivety Morse was happy to exploit. Importantly, Samuel Morse did not see rewards in the unknowable future. He instead saw danger and loss and grief. His personality traits did not qualify him to be an entrepreneur. This is something we're going to be exploring more in season 2. Morse was neurotic, and his neuroticism made him feel negative emotions longer and stronger. This is why he felt so threatened, and I think that explains what was really going on. So what was going on between the bullshit story on the Sully and when the telegraph came out? Well, he'd not really made any progress whatsoever. At least he'd not gone beyond a switch and a wire that was connected to a voltaic pile. What we do know for sure in those few years after he arrived back from Paris is that he joined the Nativist Party. He wrote anti-immigration articles under a pseudonym, of course, including articles entitled Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. Even in his day, this soared to the heights of paranoia. Now, there's a lot to choose from, but this passage more or less sums up Samuel Morse. Silence, it would seem, has been the word of command on this subject from headquarters and from Maine to Louisiana throughout the Roman Catholic ranks, with that perfectness of discipline for which this despotic sect is famous. The word of command is strictly obeyed. He was terrified of the Pope. He was terrified of Catholics. Now, in that period, he ran for mayor of New York twice. This multicultural city, multicultural now, multicultural back then, thoroughly rejected him. He hardly registered any votes at all. Later, after succeeding with the telegraph, Morse published an argument on the ethical position of slavery. Here we find him at his most despicable. Conscience in this matter has moved some Christians quite as strongly to view abolitionism as a sin of the deepest dye, as it has other Christian minds to view slavery as a sin. Who is to decide in a conflict of consciences? If the Bible is to be umpire, as I hold it to be, then it is the abolitionist that is denounced as worthy of excommunication. What awful trick is Samuel Morse playing here? He is accusing other Christians of toxic compassion, toxic empathy. He's weaponizing their Christianity, their faith, and the Bible against them. Does this sound familiar given all what is currently happening in the United States? Behind this paranoia and this argument, we find a deep, deep motivation for Morse's interest in the telegraph. He wanted to make sure that he owned it and that he operated it so he could fight back with propaganda against the papists, the Jews, and all the non-whites, the Italians and the bloody Catholics who wanted to come into his precious United States. This changes the context of the very first message sent over the telegraph. What hath God wrought? In the wonderful biography, The Lightning Man, written by Kenneth Silverman, the author says the following. His work on the telegraph had all along been sustained by his belief that technology and theology were two sides of the same thing, that the inspiration and end of his invention was the greater glory of God. And secondly, God's country. God's country was, of course, the United States. So Morse dreamed of shaping the world using electronic communications to push his white supremacy. Later, using the Vox radio, Adolf Hitler would succeed where Morse failed, warping the opinions of a whole nation. There is a lot of history hidden from us in technology. Maybe it's because we don't want to look. We are drawn to technology because, in my case at least, I didn't like working with people. I preferred working with computers, less emotional, less complex. But the truth is that we are part of the world, and technologies that work at scale, like the technologies of Samuel Morse, really do have societal and political implications. It is therefore important, especially right now at this moment in history, to try to understand technology's long-running association with, well, for want of a better expression, white supremacy. This is the history that has been hidden from us. Now, you might think maybe Samuel Morse was an outlier. However, my theme of white supremacy and fearful men driving this agenda forward continues with Alexander Graham Bell. He picked up where Morse left off, and therefore the real Alexander Graham Bell is nothing like the Bell that you might know, the one perfected by AT&T's billion-dollar PR machine. Bell's supremacy, white supremacy, really all started with the arrival of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Up until that point, racism more or less lived in the realms of superstition. Part of that superstition came from the Bible, Genesis 9:20. It's a Friday night. Noah basically gets piss drunk. Eventually, he becomes unconscious, falls over, and his robe flies up, thus exposing his private parts. So Ham comes home, finds his dad with his dick out on the floor of the tent, if indeed they lived in tents. He panics and runs and grabs his two brothers, Shem and Japheth. They then cover up Noah. Noah eventually wakes up. He has, of course, a sore head. He's like a bear with a sore head, very, very angry. And he says, "Cursed be Canaan," that is Ham's son. "A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Canaan is then exiled to Africa, where the climate degenerates him, turns his skin black, and of course, that is the biblical justification for white supremacy, and of course, it's the biblical justification for the North Atlantic slave trade. Another superstitious belief at the time focused on creatures that had not descended from Adam and Eve. They included fairies, giants, pygmies, griffins, sirens, Africans, and the newly discovered inhabitants of the Americas. My goodness, so what this means is that in the olden days, racism was a bit weird. It involved pixies and pygmies and giants and the Bible and Noah's dick. However, there are two very important aspects to these old-fashioned ideas. The degenerated, the descendants of Ham, they still had a soul. They could be brought back to God, and this explains the work of missionaries. This means no matter how despicable this ancient racism was, there was still hope for those people who were non-white Europeans. However, on the other side of that argument, there was no hope whatsoever for those creatures who had not descended from Adam and Eve. And of course, that could be used to justify the most awful treatment, which of course the Spanish did when they conquered and enslaved the whole of South America. These superstitious arguments formed the basis of Samuel Morse's white supremacy. However, this white supremacy took on a more scientific basis with what I've been describing as the longest lasting fuck up in our history. A progressive, non-racist, or at least the least racist scientist of his day, who kept books in his library from his so-called black brothers, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, put together a categorization of humans as he tried to understand the differences between different types of people. However, Blumenbach quickly came to the conclusion that humans are biologically all the same, and his observations that biological race was a fantasy once DNA was discovered and analysed were proven correct. However, his taxonomy, which he only invented to help himself think, placed white Europeans right at the centre of it. When white Europeans classified other people, they had a terrible habit of putting themselves at the very top of the hierarchy. It's too embarrassing to say out loud. You see where we're going with this, right? If one type of person defines what is best, and what is best is what they are, then it almost guarantees that other people will never ever live up to this expectation and this ideal. And so enlightened thinkers like Blumenbach, in trying to bring the human race together, had accidentally laid the foundation for centuries of division and white supremacy. Well, what was in this taxonomy of Blumenbach's? Actually, not that much. Only 5 categories of people: Caucasian, Mongoloid, Ethiopian, American, and Malay. Thus, Blumenbach set in motion the idea that Caucasians or whites were superior to the other inferior types of people. And thus, with his taxonomy, you see the beginning of the end of old-fashioned, superstitious, biblical white supremacy or racism. Unfortunately, it was immediately superseded by something much more sinister. Charles Darwin's new theory of evolution collided with an old idea, the work of a man called Mendel. When these two things came together, white supremacy or racism all of a sudden had a scientific foundation. Now, lost to history was the work of Mendel. Mendel worked out that peas contained something that they somehow transmitted to their kids, sometimes, but to their grandkids other times. For example, a pea might be crinkled, or it might be smooth. It might have a white or purple flower. It might be yellow, or in a green pod. Now, Mendelian logic, that somebody would later call queer logic, seemed to defy common sense. If both parents were yellow, why wasn't the kid yellow? And then even more confusing, how had the yellowness skipped a generation to create some yellow grandkids? Well, of course, they were recessive genes, by the way, that's the reason. Mendel's inheritance was lost to time, but it came roaring back to life with Darwin's observation that number 1, species are shaped by their environment, and number 2, they are unchangeable within their lifetimes. In other words, that the variation between humans can only be explained by hereditariness. Then white supremacy got a God Almighty, quote-unquote, scientific boost. The racism appeared in a couple of places. On the societal level, it was social Darwinism. The poor are poor because of their terrible genes, and the rich are rich because of their good genes. And in the case of the English upper classes, not because a relative raped around the world with the East India Trading Company, and not because a relative traded in slaves. Politically, social Darwinism had huge implications. Firstly, education was useless because we were unchangeable within our lifetimes. But so too was the idea of a welfare state. Helping people was the equivalent not just of keeping a runt alive, but allowing it to breed and thus pollute future stock. Now, social Darwinism was pretty hands-off. Basically, it was about leaving people to survive and pass on their genes or not pass on their genes. The second thing, though, that emerged from Mendel and Darwin's work was much, much more hands-on. This was the so-called science of eugenics. Francis Galton, Darwin's much more pig-headed cousin, ran with Charles's ideas, and he came to the following conclusion. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that it must be highly injurious to the race of man. Whoa, right. Now, you might think all of this sounds quaint, right? But to this day, posh people always talk about coming from good stock. If you watch any American TV show, they're always looking for a Caucasian man. But up until the 1990s, when I was a kid, children with Down syndrome were called mongoloids. Thus, the work of Blumenbach and the Victorian scientists live with us even today. Eugenics came in two flavors. So we have social Darwinism and we have eugenics, and then eugenics breaks into two schools of thought. One thought, riffing on the breeding of animals, wanted to make sure that the good bred with the good and the poor stock were encouraged to breed less. That was called positive eugenics, so nobody was getting killed yet. Negative eugenics, on the other hand, focused on castration, immigration control, marriage control, expatriation. That means sending people back to where they came from, although if they were born in your country, where would you be sending them back to? And when you think of all those ideas to do with negative eugenics, and then you merge them with the idea that some people are not really people because they haven't descended from Adam and Eve, then it's only one logical step to go from immigration control to organized extermination, because the people you are killing are not humans anyway, they're more akin to animals. This is where Alexander Graham Bell comes into the picture. You remember his mum and wife were deaf. He dedicated a huge part of his life to helping deaf children. He was still at that when eugenics became a thing, when eugenics came to the fore. He then turned to breeding sheep. He was a positive eugenicist. So he wanted to learn how to breed sheep so he could breed deafness out of the human race. Bell was a member of the American Breeders Association, the ABA, and they started a committee on eugenics. Alexander Graham Bell was on the committee. His work continued. 10 years later, he spoke to the Bureau of Census. He wanted to collect data on people's parents. The Bureau of Census, thankfully, refused. Eugenics, legitimised by Bell and many, many other often well-meaning scientists or thinkers of the day, led to the 1922 creation of the Eugenics Committee of the United States. Its job was to, quote, disseminate the eugenics ideal throughout society and thereby alter the course of history, unquote. The man behind a lot of these ideas and the man behind the Eugenics Committee was called Madison Grant. In 1916, he published a book called The Passing of the Great Race. The book covered the 4 tenets of eugenics. Number 1, the promotion of selective breeding. Again, we are treating people like animals. The strong and the wise should be allowed to breed, and the poor and the pathetic should not be allowed to breed. By the way, that would have meant Samuel Morse would have been disqualified from having children. Number 2, sterilisation of the unfit. Number 3, the use of testing to work out the mentally unfit, which of course people from non-white groups always were, and so they always failed the test. And number 4, the limiting of immigration of ethnic and racial groups. Now, Samuel Morse didn't want Italians and Catholics coming in to the United States, but of course, at the turn of the last century, many followers of Madison Grant did not want Jews to enter into the United States. Think about this for 1 second. 1922, in the United States, there is a eugenics committee, and its job is to push this political ideal. This idea would not go away. And so you may think of eugenics being a German notion, of course, with the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, but the truth is it was the United States and Great Britain that really brought this science to the forefront and continued to legitimise it. And who knows what might have happened if Madison Grant had have got his way in the United States. And so now we need to take a breath. we have looked at an alternate history of Samuel Morse and Alexander Graham Bell. And what we've seen is that, especially in Morse's case, he wanted and he understood that a large-scale communication system could be used to shape the mood of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people simultaneously. With that in mind, let's now try to link back Samuel Morse and Alexander Graham Bell's white supremacy with some of the other themes of this podcast, starting, of course, with this idea that there is nothing new under the sun. Now, it is true, I learned that a little bit from historians, but I mainly learnt it from my own field of innovation. Stuart Kaufman, a scientist specialising in biology and systems, came up with the idea of the adjacent possibility. Now, the adjacent possibility is a bit like the edge of a map. It is what might come next. Volta started with 2 discs, a bit of salt water, and a frog's leg. What was adjacent to that? His tongue. What was adjacent to that? His eye. What was adjacent to that? A converter that took an electrical signal as an input and created a mark on a bit of paper as its output. But Volta did not find that adjacent possibility. No, that was Samuel Morse. And he found it 3 decades after the battery had been invented. So Morse did not invent the telegraph from scratch, but rather he stuck a converter on the end of a wire, and the wire itself was stuck on a voltaic pile. Perdix found the adjacent possible when he looked at those fish bones and he saw the saw. However, and this is the kicker, it is not just technologies that the adjacent possibility applies to. In Series 1, we met Jay Gould, and in just a few paragraphs, we learned about how to short stocks, which is easy and illegal, of course, especially when you're armed with a bit of inside information. We learned how to use technology to scale a business without scaling its headcount, and how to make money by holding key technologies that a competitor needs. Who are today's Goulds? That's the question. Who is shorting what, and what insider knowledge do they have? You see, the trick to a speculative bubble is to blow it up. You remember Jay Gould did that when he inflated the price of gold, and his plan was to get out just before it burst. And don't forget, he had insider knowledge because he was connected to Ulysses S. Grant's White House. Right now, the generative AI bubble is making people obscenely rich. Will it burst soon? And if so, who will benefit? Who are the Jay Goulds? Now, speaking of the obscenely rich, technology companies have a way of doing that, which to the untrained eye may defy explanation. But we found an explanation, didn't we, with Theodore Vail? Many technologies make sense when they are natural monopolies. There was no point, we saw, having 2 sets of wires above the streets of New York, and it was impossible, for example, to lay 2 sets of cables under the same piece of sidewalk. Now, once a company has a monopoly position, others cannot enter the space. And even if they could, in the case of the telephone, the switching costs are too high. This led to the consolidation of wealth in a small number of hands, which in turn led to the image of the octopus strangling the life out of American society, which of course is what Robert Hunter's 1904 book, Poverty, was all about. And this is what Robert Hunter said. While but 1% of the families hold more than the remaining 99%, so 1% of American families hold 99% of the wealth. Now, this may seem like a modern idea, but actually the idea of the 1%ers comes all the way from the turn of the last century. Right, now we're getting somewhere. Then, like now, demagogues, especially if they are part of industry, create and then can further exploit grievances in society. This makes it easy to fan the flames of hatred. Thus, at the turn of the last century, those who created technologies contributed to social divisions because they contributed to inequality. Some of them, but not all, legitimized white supremacy, and then they used their own communication tools, something that Morse and Edison had learned, to shape public opinion. When all of that exploitable division and the new science of eugenics collided with Harold Arnold's vacuum tube inside the Volksradio, the Third Reich could shape and distort the mood of a whole nation of people. And so we can now return to Bruegel's landscape with the fall of Icarus. The partridge watches as he plunges into the sea. Who is Icarus this time around? At the turn of the last century, Icarus was the human race, falling under the weight of its own stupidity. Falling because a creature, a species only slightly smarter than a chimpanzee, has for the very first time in its history the powers of the gods. That is, of course, very easy for me to say from my vantage point of 2026. Another theme of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines is the idea from Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, that life can be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. That is what our great-great-grandparents were trying to do, live their lives forward, to come to terms with electricity and electronics and wide-scale communication systems, not to mention the idea of hereditability. These are all big themes, but of course, what else have we got? What else did we look at? In other words, what else could history teach us from the turn of the last century right now in this funny old age of artificial intelligence? Firstly, technologies are often solutions looking for problems. This really does put to bed this stupid idea that necessity is the mother of invention. Sometimes it is, but mainly curiosity is the mother of invention. And so the lesson for modern managers, that's you guys listening in, is that you need to create a space, like Thomas Edison did at Menlo Park, for people to fail. Not just a space to fail, but a space where people feel safe to fail. Now, related to this, another theme of our work is that the destiny of a system lies with its users. Take a look at those old photographs of the electricity grid's first applications, such as irons. They're not plugged into a wall socket, but rather into a light bulb's socket. And that's because they had no idea at the time that the grid would be used for things other than lighting up a room. It was originally called a system to subdivide light. Now, the same is true for the telegraph. It was useless for ages until creative users realized it could be used for keeping passengers at the station up to date. And then a new coalition, the Associated Press, realised that pooling stories reduced their members' telegraph bill. Now, sometime later, Western Union figured out how to do bank transfers. And when they did so, they basically invented e-commerce. All of this idea that the user dictates the destiny of a technology led to my concept of the third inventor. The first inventor creates a component. The second builds the system. But the third inventor, equally important, maps a new technology to an often unarticulated and unknown user need. This final stage of invention requires creativity that is different to the creativity needed for rearranging components into a system, which is in turn different from the creativity involved in the continuous improvements needed to bring these components to life. And so you see creativity reappearing in different places. And again, the lesson for managers and leaders tuning in is simple. You've got to create space for your people to connect new and emerging technologies with new and often unarticulated user needs. Those people need to be given space to play. And when people were given space to play, what did they come up with? Advertisements and propaganda. This started innocently enough. Edison, when he was a teenager, teamed up with a telegrapher to create summaries of the news. This was a form of advertisement for the newspapers he sold. But in Morse's hands, with white supremacy on his mind, you can see a much more sinister idea for using these systems at scale. Luckily for us, Morse soon learned the lesson that we've already learned. The creator does not control a technology's destinies, but its users does. And the technology users, in the main, were sensible people like you and me. And they were not foaming at the mouth, mad fucking racists. So Samuel Morse's telegraph escaped his grasp. He never created a system that he wanted to create. And that system was never put to the uses to which he wanted to put it to use. However, what the past does show us, though, is that technologies that communicate at scale can alter the moods of a whole nation. We've seen in recent years small pieces of information helped Amazon and Netflix, way before artificial intelligence joined the party, to shape the buying and viewing habits of millions and then billions of people. Is this a little bit like Edison's PR with his telegraph system? Yeah, it seems innocent enough, doesn't it? However, in much more sinister hands, as the Cambridge Analytica scandal showed us, small pieces of personal information can be used to swing presidential elections and to swing the Brexit vote in Europe. Thus, the past with Samuel Morse, the work of the Third Reich, and of course Thomas Edison, teaches something not just about our recent history, but right now about our present. In Donald Trump's America and many other countries, the tenets of eugenics, and especially the limiting of movement for ethnic and racial groups, are on the rise at the moment that generative engines like ChatGPT are using models that are trained without any regulation and without any government oversight. The Third Reich did not change Germany's citizens into a foaming mass of murderous lunatics overnight. They did it slowly, over years, chipping away, chip, 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 chip. What if generative AI is doing that right now to all of us? And then when you combine the generative engines with the cesspool of social media, how do you know you're not voting against your own best interests? How do you know you're not vilifying and demonizing an outgroup? We don't know, do we? And so that is the real lesson of Visionaries and Rebels and Machines Season 1. Technologies emerge, they come from curiosity, we use them to sell our products, and it's all innocent enough. But when a system gets to a certain scale, it can be used at scale for good and for bad. And right now, we have got the most powerful technologies that we, as humans, have ever had. If we had godlike powers 100 years ago, what on earth do we have right now? So you must remember the leitmotif of the history of computing. It's not the creators of a technology that dictates its destiny, but its users. You're one of those users, and I'm another. We've got to remember that right now, because the future that is about to arrive, the future that we want, needs to be shaped by all of us. And if we can do that, then the future won't belong to the machines, all the white supremacists, all the demagogues, all the frogs, all the technical determinists. It will instead belong to you and to me and to the rest of mankind. Vannevar Bush, desperate to keep the mind of his young student open, had to find him a PhD dissertation. But in what? Genetics. Yes, genetics. It's got maths and switches and, much more importantly, some queer underlying Mendelian logic. Yes. Vannevar Bush's student might just be able to figure this out. And thus, Claude Shannon found himself in the Eugenics Records office, where the embarrassing pseudoscience of the white supremacists would actually allow him to gestate and then birth a real science. We call it information theory. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show, and of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.